The envelope was still damp from the morning dew when Lauren Hayes held it out across the porch, and Ryan Carter's hand stopped halfway to taking it, because something in the way she was holding it, both palms, like it might slip, told him this wasn't a thank you card. He took it anyway. Inside was a single photograph, its edges soft with age, and the moment his eyes found the two young women laughing in it, arms slung over each other's shoulders in front of a dorm building he didn't recognize. The coffee mug in his other hand simply left his fingers, hit the porch boards, and broke clean in half, the dark liquid spreading fast across the gray wood between them. He didn't move to clean it. He didn't say anything at all. One of the women in the photograph was younger, sharper-eyed, a version of the woman standing in front of him, now that he had never met and never would. The other was Emily, his wife, 22 years old, alive in a way he hadn't seen her in 3 years, laughing at something just out of frame, wearing a jacket he still had folded in a box in the hall closet. Lauren Hayes, CEO of a company worth more than Ryan would earn in 6 lifetimes of fixing other people's houses, stood on his porch in jeans and an old sweater, waiting for him to say something, anything, and for a long moment all he could do was stare at a woman he'd known for exactly 1 day, and a photograph of a woman he'd loved for a lifetime, and try to understand how the two had ever occupied the same frame. To find out how a guarded, exhausted CEO ended up handing a grieving single father proof of a friendship he never knew his late wife had kept secret, and what that photograph would end up costing both of them before it was through. Stay until the very end. If stories like this one mean something to you, the ones about people who show up quietly, who fix what's broken without being asked, who carry more than anyone around them realizes. We'd love to hear that from you in the comments, because so many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves. And this channel exists because of that. There's a debate worth having honestly, and it's this one. When someone is still grieving, does the kindest thing you can do is leave them alone and let time do its work? Or does real healing only start when someone is brave enough to gently, persistently show up anyway? Ryan would have told you, if you'd asked him 3 years ago, that he wanted to be left alone forever. He would have been wrong. But nobody could have told him that. He had to find it out. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Not the friendship, not the photograph, not the fence. Ryan Carter had been a structural design engineer for 11 years. The kind of engineer whose name went on load calculations that kept parking garages and pedestrian bridges from failing, quiet and precise in a way that made him easy to overlook in meetings, and impossible to overlook when something actually needed to be right. He and Emily had a daughter, Sophie, 4 years old at the time, all elbows and questions, and a house with a mortgage they could afford, and a yard Emily was slowly turning into something she called a pollinator garden, though mostly it was just chaos and good intentions. Then, on a Tuesday in March, Emily didn't wake up. An underlying heart condition nobody had ever caught, the doctors said. The kind that gives no warning and takes no time. Ryan buried his wife on a Saturday and was back at his desk 2 weeks later. Because the mortgage didn't care that his world had ended. And for 8 months, he tried to be both parents and a full-time engineer, and found that grief does not politely wait its turn. He missed a deadline. Then a decimal point in a stress calculation, caught by a colleague before it went anywhere dangerous, but caught nonetheless, and caught in front of people. Nobody at the firm knew Sophie had stopped sleeping through the night, that Ryan was running on 90 minutes of sleep some evenings, that he'd stopped answering calls from his own mother, because he didn't have anything left to give anyone. He didn't tell them. He decided, in the quiet, stubborn way that would define him for years afterward, that his daughter needed a father who came home at 5 o'clock more than she needed a father with a prestigious title. And so when the firm suggested, not unkindly, that perhaps a leave of absence would be wise, Ryan resigned instead, and became within a year a residential contractor. Fences, decks, small renovations, the kind of work where the hours were his own, and nobody asked him to explain himself. That was how, 3 years later, he came to be standing in Sophie's window at 6 in the morning after a storm that had ripped through the whole neighborhood, looking at the wreckage of his neighbor's back fence, 8 full sections of cedar plank torn loose and scattered like matchsticks across her yard. Lauren Hayes had bought the house 18 months earlier, the kind of purchase people in the neighborhood still talked about at the mailboxes. The CEO of Meridian Kestrel, a logistics and infrastructure firm that had gone from regional player to national name under her leadership, paying cash for the old Whitfield place and moving in with almost nothing, as if she didn't quite trust herself to unpack. She kept to herself. She left before 6 most mornings in a black SUV and came home well after Sophie's bedtime, and the only real conversations Ryan had ever had with her were the kind exchanged over a shared property line, a wave, a comment about the weather, once a brief, oddly grateful thank you, when he'd cleared a branch off her driveway without being asked. He knew, the way everyone in the neighborhood knew, that she was under enormous pressure that particular week. Meridian Kestrel was 3 days from closing a $400 million merger that would either cement the company's future or, according to the one time he'd overheard her on the phone in her own driveway, unravel 2 years of work and take a significant piece of her reputation down with it. She was hosting the final round of investor dinners at her own house that very evening, a detail he only knew because her assistant had mentioned it to his neighbor across the street the day before. The kind of small-talk fact that travels through a quiet street the way water finds a crack. Her fence, the one separating her yard from the ravine behind it, was the first thing anyone arriving that evening would see from her back terrace, and it was currently in pieces. Ryan stood at his window for a long moment, coffee going cold in his hand, watching a woman in a bathrobe stand very still in the wreckage of her yard with her phone pressed to her ear, saying words he couldn't hear, but could read easily enough in the set of her shoulders. He thought about Sophie, still asleep down the hall, about the report card conference at 9 that meant he had a window of exactly 3 hours, about the fact that fixing another person's fence was not, by any reasonable definition, his job or his business. Then he thought about the 8 months after Emily died, the ones nobody had known enough to help him through, because he'd never told anyone he needed it, and how the one time a neighbor had shown up with a casserole and mowed his lawn without being asked, without waiting to be thanked, it had meant more to him than almost anything else that whole terrible year. He set the coffee down. He went to get his tools. He worked fast and he worked quietly, the way he did everything, hauling the split-cedar planks to the side of the yard, measuring what could be salvaged and what needed replacing outright, running to the hardware store the moment it opened, and coming back with lumber strapped to the roof of his truck before Lauren had even finished her second phone call of the morning. By 8:15, 6 of the 8 sections were rebuilt and standing, sturdier than they'd been before the storm, the new cedar pale and raw against the weathered gray of the old boards. He was setting the final post when Lauren came out onto her terrace, phone still in hand, and stopped so abruptly that whoever was on the other end of the call must have heard the silence, because she said something quick and distracted and hung up. She didn't say thank you first. She said, "What are you doing?" in a tone that wasn't quite hostile but wasn't far from it either. The voice of someone whose entire morning had already gone sideways and who had no capacity left for surprises, even good ones. Ryan straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said simply that he'd noticed the fence, that he had the morning free, that he figured it might matter to her before the evening. He didn't mention the investor dinner. He didn't need to. She understood immediately what he was telling her, and something in her face shifted. Not quite gratitude, more like suspicion of gratitude. The look of a person so unused to unearned kindness that her first instinct was to look for the catch. "I'll pay you," she said. "Send me an invoice, double whatever your rate is." Ryan told her that wasn't necessary. She insisted, more firmly this time, in the clipped tone he'd later learned she used on people who didn't understand that she was not asking a second time, and he found himself, oddly, digging in just as firmly. He said he didn't do it for money. He said, and this was the only personal thing he offered her that whole morning, that he knew what it was like to need someone to show up without being asked why, and that he wasn't going to send her a bill for something that hadn't cost him anything but a Saturday morning. Lauren looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look people give a math problem that isn't resolving the way they expected, and then she thanked him, briskly, and went back inside. And Ryan finished the last section of fence alone. He thought that would be the end of it. 2 weeks later, at the fall block party the neighborhood association threw every October in the small park at the end of the street, Ryan brought Sophie, who wanted nothing more than to win the ring toss and eat exactly one hot dog, and it was there, in front of a dozen neighbors and Lauren's own assistant, that the humiliation happened. Small and sharp and entirely unintended, the way real humiliations usually are. Ryan had approached her, meaning only to say hello, and had mentioned, lightly he thought, an easy joke, that her fence was holding up well. Lauren, 3 days out from the merger's final vote, exhausted, cornered at a community event by 3 board members' spouses she was supposed to be charming, distracted by a call she was visibly trying not to take, glanced at him and said, in front of everyone standing there, that she appreciated the gesture, but that she really didn't have time to discuss home repairs right now, and could they talk about it some other time. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't even, by the standards of a woman running a merger worth nearly $500 million, unreasonable. But it landed on Ryan the way a slammed door lands on someone who was only trying to say good morning, and he felt, for one long silent second, exactly the way he'd felt for years at the old firm. Useful, dismissible. A man whose contributions were fine to accept and inconvenient to acknowledge. He said nothing. He took Sophie's hand, told her it was time to go find that ring toss, and walked away. And if Lauren noticed the look on his face as he left, she gave no sign of it. Already turning back to the conversation that actually mattered to her that evening. He didn't wave to her over the fence line after that. When he saw her SUV pull into the driveway in the evenings, he made sure he was inside. It wasn't anger, exactly. Ryan didn't really do anger, hadn't in years. It was closer to a quiet recalibration, the same one he'd made after leaving the firm. Some people's worlds simply didn't have room in them for a man like him, and the only sensible response was to stop trying to fit into that space and go back to the one that did. The one with Sophie's homework and her Saturday soccer games, and the small, contained life he'd built, for the two of them, out of the wreckage of the one he used to have. What none of them at the block party could have known, not Lauren, not Ryan, not the assistant standing 3 feet away scrolling her phone, was that the merger closings that week would trigger a due diligence review of Meridian Kestrel's early investor documents, the kind of routine archival process nobody ever expects to matter, and buried in a box of old materials transferred from a defunct predecessor company, would be a set of personal letters that had been misfiled decades earlier. Letters that had absolutely nothing to do with mergers or logistics firms and everything to do with 2 college roommates who had promised, in ink now faded nearly to nothing, to never lose touch. 8 months would pass before that box was finally opened, and before the fence, the dismissal, and the photograph in the envelope would all turn out to be pieces of the very same unfinished story. Neither of them yet knew they were living inside. The merger closed. Meridian Kestrel's stock did exactly what Lauren had promised her board it would do. And by every external measure, the following months were the most successful of her professional life. A cover feature in a trade magazine, a seat on an industry council, the kind of validation she had spent 15 years clawing toward. And yet she found herself, more nights than she would have admitted to anyone, standing at her own kitchen window, looking out at a fence made of raw, unweathered cedar that hadn't yet faded to match the rest, thinking about a conversation she'd cut short in a park because she'd been too tired and too frightened of her own board to spare 90 seconds for a neighbor who had spent his Saturday morning fixing something that wasn't his to fix. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a great many things didn't matter, which was, if she was honest with the version of herself that only showed up at 2 in the morning, most of how she'd gotten to where she was. It was her assistant, Priya, who found the box. Meridian Kestrel's legal team, closing out the final phase of due diligence, had requested every archived document connected to the company's original predecessor, a small regional freight brokerage Lauren had acquired and folded into the business a decade earlier. And among the crates of contracts and tax filings was a single unmarked box that had nothing to do with the company at all. Personal effects, apparently, from an office that had once belonged to a woman named Emily Reyes Carter, who had briefly worked reception at the brokerage in her 20s before the company changed hands, and who had, judging by the box's contents, once been close enough with someone to keep a decade of letters and photographs in a desk drawer she'd forgotten to clear out. Priya, doing her job with the mild, thorough curiosity of someone who reads everything, recognized the handwriting on the top letter immediately. because she'd seen the same looping signature on the inside cover of a paperback that had sat on Lauren's office shelf for as long as Priya had worked for her. A book Lauren had never once explained, and clearly never intended to. She brought the box to Lauren's office without a word and set it on the desk, and left, and Lauren sat with it for a long time before she opened it. Inside were 7 letters and 4 photographs, and by the 3rd letter Lauren understood, with the particular vertigo of a memory arriving decades late, that Emily Reyes, the wide-eyed roommate who had talked her through 2 brutal semesters of business school, who had been, for 2 formative years, the only person who ever made Lauren feel like more than a resume, had married a man named Ryan Carter and had a daughter, and had, at some point in the years after Lauren had let the friendship quietly lapse under the weight of first jobs and long hours and the slow erosion that happens to friendships nobody tends carefully enough, died. Lauren hadn't known. She hadn't known any of it. She had let a woman who once mattered enormously to her disappear so completely from her life that she hadn't even recognized, standing in a driveway a mile from her own new house, that the quiet contractor who'd fixed her fence, without being asked, was the widower of the person whose photograph she'd carried in a paperback for 20 years, without ever quite admitting to herself. Why? She didn't go to him immediately. She sat with the letters for 3 days, rereading the same handful of pages, and it was Priya, watching her employer show up distracted and hollow-eyed to meetings for the better part of a week, who finally asked directly what was wrong, and it was Priya who, once Lauren told her, said the thing Lauren badly needed someone to say. That guilt kept privately was just another form of the same avoidance that had already cost her one friendship, and that if she wanted to do anything differently this time, she needed to actually walk across the yard and say it out loud. That was the conversation that ended in a broken coffee mug on Ryan's porch. What Lauren offered him first, standing there amid the spilled coffee, was almost comically wrong for the moment. She'd rehearsed, in the sleepless nights leading up to it, an offer to fund a college account for Sophie, to make some grand corrective gesture that would balance whatever ledger she imagined existed between them. Ryan didn't want it. He told her, once he could speak again, staring at the photograph rather than at her, that he didn't need her money and didn't want her guilt managed on his porch, but that he did want to know everything, every letter, every year she'd known Emily before he had, because there were entire chapters of his wife's life that had closed the day she died, and he had assumed, wrongly it turned out, that no one was left alive who could open them again. It wasn't forgiveness for the block party, not yet, though Lauren apologized for that too, awkwardly, unused to apologizing for anything smaller than a quarterly earnings miss. It was something else. A door Ryan hadn't known was still unlocked, cracking open half an inch. It would have stayed cracked open gently, slowly, if not for what happened 3 weeks later, when Meridian Kestrel's largest remaining investor, spooked by an unrelated industry downturn, threatened to pull out of a second-phase financing round unless Lauren could personally secure their confidence at a gala the company was hosting in 6 weeks. The same 6 weeks, as it happened, that Sophie's class had been assigned a family history project. The kind of assignment that sends 8-year-olds home asking their fathers questions about their mothers that fathers aren't always ready to answer. 6 weeks would pass in which Lauren fought to save the second phase of financing for a deal that could define the next decade of her career, and in which Ryan sat across the kitchen table from his daughter trying to explain, for the first time in 3 years, who her mother had really been before he'd known her, and neither of them yet understood how completely those two struggles were about to collide. The gala Meridian Kestrel had planned was, by any measure, an enormous production. 300 guests, the largest ballroom the city's best hotel had to offer, a stage built specifically for the announcement Lauren needed to make about the company's next decade, and a forecast, 2 days out, calling for the same kind of violent early-season storm system that had torn her fence apart 18 months before, this time predicted to hit not her backyard but the hotel's outdoor terrace, where the caterers had built an elaborate open-air reception structure that the hotel's own engineers were now saying, with 2 days to spare, might not hold. It was Priya who called Ryan, not Lauren, because Lauren was 3 meetings deep trying to keep her nervous investor from walking, and Priya had remembered, from some offhand comment months earlier, that the quiet man next door used to design structures for a living before he started building fences. Ryan drove to the hotel that afternoon, walked the terrace once with the building engineer who was too proud to admit he was out of his depth, and did in 40 minutes what the hotel's contracted firm hadn't managed in 2 days. Identified the load points that would fail under wind shear, recalculated the bracing the structure actually needed using nothing but a tape measure, a notepad, and 11 years of training nobody at that hotel knew he still carried, and then spent the rest of the afternoon and half the night alongside 2 crews he'd called in himself, retrofitting a temporary structure that would hold through anything the storm could throw at it. He didn't tell anyone what he used to do for a living. He didn't need to. The hotel's own engineer, watching him work, asked at one point, almost accusingly, where exactly he'd trained, and Ryan answered so precisely and so completely without ego that the man simply stopped asking and started following instructions instead. Lauren found out only when she arrived the night of the gala, an hour before doors opened, and saw Ryan on a ladder in a suit jacket he'd clearly borrowed because his tool clothes weren't appropriate for the room, checking a final connection point, while Priya stood below holding his phone and reading him wind-load numbers off a weather app. She stood at the entrance to the terrace for a long moment, watching a man she had once dismissed in a park because she didn't have 90 seconds for him, quietly save the single most important night of her professional year. And something in her chest that had been carefully managed and controlled for 15 years simply gave way. The storm hit exactly on schedule, 40 minutes into the reception, and the terrace held perfectly in fact, while half the city's other outdoor events that night reportedly did not. And by the time the investor Lauren had been fighting to keep pulled her aside near the end of the evening, visibly moved by the display of competence under pressure that the whole disaster had inadvertently produced, to say that Meridian Kestrel clearly had exactly the kind of operational excellence he wanted his firm associated with. Lauren understood that the deal she'd been terrified of losing had just been saved by a man whose name wasn't even on the guest list, a man she had once told to his face that she didn't have time for him. She found him afterward on the terrace, alone, coiling a length of rope with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and asked him, quietly, why he'd never told her, not just that night, but ever, in all the month she'd known him, what he used to be. Ryan considered the question longer than the answer probably warranted, and then told her the truth he'd never fully said out loud to anyone, not even Sophie, that after Emily died, he'd made a choice to become a smaller, quieter version of himself on purpose, because a father who came home every night at 5 o'clock mattered more to a 4-year-old than a father whose name was on important buildings, and somewhere in that choice he'd also decided, without quite meaning to, that the rest of the world didn't need to know what he'd given up, because grief that gets discussed gets pitied, and he had never once wanted to be pitied. It was at the time the most Lauren had ever heard him say about himself, and it undid something in her that the merger, the gala, and every professional triumph of the past year had left entirely intact. She told him then, because it felt, standing on that terrace in the wreckage of a storm they'd both just survived, like the only honest thing left to say, that she had let Emily disappear from her life through nothing but neglect and cowardice, that she had built an entire career on being too busy for the people who mattered, and that watching him work that night, uncredited and unbothered by the lack of credit, had made her ashamed of every gala, every headline, every version of success she'd chased instead of picking up a phone. Neither of them knew, standing there, that within the week Lauren's own board, specifically the chairman who had quietly opposed her leadership for 2 years, and had been waiting for any opening to argue she was distracted from the company's real priorities, would use the visible, public nature of her connection to the contractor from the gala, as he dismissively called Ryan in a closed-door meeting, as ammunition for a leadership challenge that would force Lauren to choose, publicly and completely, between the image the board wanted from her and the truth of who she actually was. 1 month later, at the company's annual shareholder meeting, that choice would be made in front of every person who had ever underestimated either of them. The chairman raised it carefully, the way men like him always did, framing it as a governance concern rather than what it actually was. A suggestion, delivered in front of the full board and a room of major shareholders. that Lauren's judgment had become compromised by a personal relationship with an unemployed contractor, that her focus had visibly wavered in recent months, that perhaps the company would be better served by new leadership heading into its next growth phase. It was a calculated moment, timed for maximum damage, and for exactly as long as it took Lauren to stand up from her chair. The room held the particular silence of an audience waiting to see whether a powerful woman would fold. She didn't defend herself the way the chairman expected. She told the room, plainly and without a single note card, about a fence torn apart by a storm, about a man who'd fixed it without being asked and refused payment, about a gala terrace that would have collapsed under 300 guests if that same man hadn't quietly, anonymously, spent a night doing structural work he'd walked away from years earlier to raise his daughter alone. She told them that Meridian Kestrel's largest new investor had specifically cited that night's crisis management as the reason he'd stayed in the deal, and that the unemployed contractor the chairman had just insulted in front of the entire shareholder body held an engineering background more rigorous than anyone currently on the board, and had simply chosen, for reasons that had nothing to do with capability, to spend the last 3 years being the kind of father his daughter needed, instead of chasing the kind of recognition rooms like this one handed out. She said that if the board wanted to remove her for finally telling the truth about who had actually saved the company's most important night, they were welcome to try. And then she sat back down, and the silence that followed was a different kind entirely. The vote, when it came 2 weeks later, was not close, and it was not in the chairman's favor. What she offered Ryan afterward, a formal position at Meridian Kestrel, director level, structural and safety oversight, a number attached to it that would have changed his and Sophie's life in every practical way. He turned down within a day of hearing it, gently and without hesitation, the way he turned most things down. What he asked for instead was smaller and, to Lauren, far harder to say no to, that the company fund a modest, ongoing scholarship for children who'd lost a parent, administered quietly, named for no one, because he didn't want a title or a plaque. He wanted something that would have actually helped Sophie in the year nobody around them had known what to do. Lauren set it up within the month and asked, almost shyly for a woman who ran a company worth billions, whether she could be the one to hand-deliver the first letters to the first families. And Ryan said that felt right. The coda came quietly, the way the best parts of Ryan's life always had. Months later, on an ordinary Sunday evening with the kind of gold, low light that makes even an unremarkable backyard look like something worth remembering, Sophie sat on the porch steps working on a school project about family, a corkboard covered in photographs. And among the pictures of Emily as a young mother was, now, the photograph from the envelope, 2 college roommates laughing outside a dorm building, one of whom was standing 20 feet away in Ryan's yard at that exact moment, helping him replace one final, weathered section of fence that had finally started to sag after 3 years of holding everything up. Sophie asked Lauren, with the blunt curiosity only an 8-year-old can get away with, whether she and her dad were going to get married, and Lauren, laughing, glanced at Ryan over the top of the fence posts they were setting together and said that some things, the good ones especially, were worth doing slowly and doing right, and Ryan, driving the last screw home, said nothing at all, which by then Lauren had learned was very often how he said the most. If you've stayed with us this far, we suspect it's because some part of this story landed somewhere real in your own life, because you know, or once knew, someone like Ryan, someone who was underestimated, dismissed, or quietly written off long before anyone bothered to actually look at what they were carrying. Has there been someone in your own life like that? A neighbor, a coworker, a parent, someone you misjudged or watched get misjudged, before the truth of who they really were finally came out? We'd genuinely love to hear their story in the comments, even if it's simply to finally give them the credit they were owed all along. And if you believe, the way we do, that quiet, overlooked people deserve to be seen, we'd love to have you stay part of this story with us so you don't miss the next one.